The interstate cracked beneath Ethan Ward's tires like the spine of some long-dead animal, each expansion joint sending a dull thud through the chassis of his rented Ford Focus. The car had been the cheapest option at Philadelphia International, a beige sedan with a faint smell of stale coffee and the kind of rental company indifference that suggested it had survived dozens of drivers who didn't care if it survived one more. Ethan didn't care either. He'd been driving for 5 hours, maybe 6. He'd lost track somewhere around the Pennsylvania Turnpike, where the road narrowed and the hills grew steeper and the billboards began advertising things that no longer existed. Motels with neon signs missing letters, truck stops that had closed during the Reagan administration, diners that promised home cooking in fonts that hadn't been used since 1972. The GPS on his phone had died 40 miles ago, somewhere past Breezewood, that strange liminal place where the turnpike met the mountains and the whole world seemed to exist in a permanent state of transition. He tried to charge it in the car, but the cigarette lighter was dead, another small failure in a car full of small failures. And so he'd been navigating by memory and road signs and the increasingly desperate hope that Grayford still existed at all. It did. Barely. The first sign appeared at mile marker 47 on State Route 19, a battered green sign with white letters so faded they seemed to be retreating from the steel surface. Grayford, PA, 22 miles. Below it, in smaller letters that had been added at some later date and with considerably less care, Historic River District, birthplace of the Pennsylvania iron industry. The historic part was doing a lot of heavy lifting. Ethan slowed the car as the road began its descent into the valley. The Appalachian foothills rose on either side, their slopes thick with oak and hickory and the kind of dense undergrowth that seemed to swallow everything it touched. The trees were just beginning to turn. It was late September, that strange time between summer's death and autumn's first real breath, and patches of orange and yellow bled through the green like wounds on the landscape. Below, the Monongahela River glittered gray in the afternoon light, a broad ribbon of water that had once carried barges full of coal and iron ore to the mills that had made this region the industrial heart of America. Now it carried nothing but silt and sediment and the ghosts of 100,000 workers who had spent their lives in the shadows of the smokestacks. Ethan had grown up in those shadows. He'd been born in Grayford, left at 18 for college in Pittsburgh, and never really looked back. His parents had moved to Florida 3 years after he graduated, his father's lungs finally giving out after 40 years of breathing steel mill air, and Ethan had no reason to return. Except now he did. The thought of Maya hit him like a physical blow, a sudden tightness in his chest that made him grip the steering wheel harder than necessary. His sister had been missing for 11 days. 11 days of phone calls to the Grayford Police Department, 11 days of emails to the University of Pittsburgh's Urban Studies Department, 11 days of increasingly desperate messages to Maya's phone that had gone straight to voicemail after the first 3. "I'm fine, Ethan," she'd said in the last message he'd received from her, a text that had come through at 2:47 a.m. on September 14th. "I found something important. I'll call you tomorrow." Tomorrow had never come. The Grayford city limits appeared without ceremony, just a small sign on the shoulder of the road, white letters on green, the kind of municipal marker that seemed to apologize for its own existence. There was no "Welcome to Grayford" arch, no tourist information center, no indication that anyone had ever been proud enough of this place to celebrate its boundaries. The road widened into a 4-lane boulevard that had once been the city's main commercial artery. On either side, the buildings rose in that particular configuration of American urban decay. Brick storefronts with empty windows, faded awnings that had been torn by decades of wind and rain, signs that advertised businesses that had been dead for 20 years. Jensen's Hardware, since 1947. The windows were boarded up, and the door had been chained shut with a padlock that looked like it had been there since the Eisenhower administration. The Grayford Gazette, your hometown paper. The newspaper had folded in 2009, but the sign remained, its red paint peeling in long strips like sunburned skin. Bellwether Telephone Exchange, this one was different. The building was still standing, a massive structure of red brick and black iron that dominated the corner of Main and Harrison. Its windows were dark, but the sign was intact, the letters cast in bronze and bolted to the facade with the kind of permanence that suggested this building would outlive everything around it. Ethan slowed the car as he passed it, something about the building pulling at his attention. There was nothing remarkable about it, just another dead telecommunications building in a city full of dead buildings. But he found himself staring at the darkened windows, wondering what they'd seen in the decades since the last operator had sat at the switchboard. He shook his head and pressed the accelerator. Maya's apartment was on the north side of the city, in the North Hill Projects, and he needed to get there before the light faded completely. The North Hill Projects had been built in the 1960s as part of the Great Society's war on poverty. The theory had been that public housing could provide a decent standard of living for the working poor while the city's industrial economy continued to boom. The reality had been considerably less optimistic. By the time the projects were completed, Grayford steel mills were already beginning their long decline, and the housing complex had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the American dream. Ethan parked the car in front of Building C, a 5-story structure of reinforced concrete and failing paint that had the grim functionality of a Soviet-era apartment block. The parking lot was half empty, and the cars that remained were mostly old, domestic sedans from the 1990s, a pickup truck with rusted wheel wells, a minivan that had seen better decades. Maya's apartment was on the 3rd floor, 3C. Ethan had the keys. His sister had given him a copy when she'd moved in, insisting that he visit, that he see what she was working on, that he understand why she'd chosen to come back to the city they'd both tried so hard to escape. He'd never used them. Not once. There'd always been another story to chase, another deadline to meet, another reason to put off the visit until next month or the month after that. Or, he pushed the thought away and climbed the concrete stairs. The hallway on the 3rd floor was long and narrow, lit by fluorescent lights that hummed with the particular frequency of institutional neglect. The walls were painted a color that might once have been beige, but had long since faded to something closer to the color of old bone. The floor was linoleum, cracked in places, worn smooth by 40 years of footsteps. Maya's door was at the end of the hall. It was unlocked. Ethan had called the Grayford PD 3 times in the days since Maya's disappearance. Each time, he'd been told that someone would investigate, that the case was under review, that they would call him back with updates. He was still waiting for those updates. The door swung open, and he stepped inside. The apartment was small, a living room, a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, but it was clean and orderly in a way that suggested Maya had been planning to stay a while. Her books were on the shelves, arranged by subject and author with the kind of precision that had always annoyed Ethan when they were growing up. Her laptop was on the kitchen table, closed but still plugged in. Her clothes were in the closet. Her dishes were in the cupboard. Her toothbrush was in the bathroom. It looked like she'd stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. It looked like she'd never left at all. Ethan moved through the apartment slowly, touching things without quite knowing why. Maya's books were mostly academic texts, urban studies, American history, the sociology of the Rust Belt. But there were also novels, poetry collections, a worn copy of The Hobbit that had been their father's. He picked it up, opened it, found the inscription on the flyleaf in their father's careful handwriting, for Maya and Ethan, who will always have adventures. Their father had been a steelworker, a man who'd spent 40 years in the shadow of the blast furnaces and never complained once. He'd wanted his children to have better lives, which was why he'd worked double shifts to pay for Ethan's journalism degree in Maya's graduate school. He died 3 years ago, his lungs finally giving out, and Ethan had been in Philadelphia chasing a story about a corrupt city councilman when it happened. He'd missed the funeral. He'd missed everything. The thought made him put the book down, his hands suddenly unsteady. He'd been a good journalist once, a damn good one. He'd broken stories that had made front-page news, won awards, been on the radar of the major networks. But somewhere along the way, the stories had become more important than the people, and he'd lost sight of why he'd started writing in the first place. And then there was the story that had ended everything. He'd spent 6 months investigating a Philadelphia city councilman named Frank Delgado, a rising star in the Democratic Party who'd been taking bribes from developers. Ethan had sources, documents, photographs, everything he needed to bring Delgado down. But at the last minute, his primary source had recanted. The documents had been revealed as forgeries, and Ethan's career had imploded in a single devastating week. The Philadelphia Inquirer had fired him. The awards had been rescinded. His name had become a cautionary tale in journalism schools across the country. And Frank Delgado had gone on to become the mayor of Philadelphia. Ethan hadn't written a word in 2 years. He found Maya's notebooks in her desk drawer, a stack of 5 spiral-bound notepads filled with her small, precise handwriting. He sat down in her chair and began to flip through them, looking for anything that might explain what had happened to her. The first few notebooks were about her thesis, the urban legends of the Rust Belt, how communities used storytelling to process economic trauma, the way that abandoned infrastructure became a kind of memory palace for forgotten histories. She'd written about the steel mills, the freight tunnels, the subway systems that had been built and abandoned in equal measure. But the last notebook was different. It was smaller than the others, a pocket-sized moleskine with a black cover and pages that were worn from use. Maya's handwriting was more rushed in this one, less careful, as though she'd been writing quickly, trying to get everything down before what? Ethan found the first entry on the 3rd page. September 1st, I've been in Grayford for 3 weeks now, and I'm starting to understand why the city feels the way it does. It's not just the economic decline, not just the abandoned buildings and empty streets. There's something else, something underneath everything, like a memory that everyone's agreed to forget. I met a man at the Route 19 diner today. His name is Jonah, and he's been living in Grayford for most of his life. He told me about the Bellman. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I believe in the things that people do to each other, and I think the Bellman might be one of those things. Ethan turned the page, his heart beginning to beat faster. September 3rd, the story goes like this. In 1973, there was an accident under the city. A tunnel collapsed, a service tunnel that ran under downtown, and dozens of people died. Maybe hundreds, if you believe what the old-timers say. The city tried to cover it up, to pretend it was just an industrial accident, but the truth was worse. The people who died weren't just workers. They were homeless people, undocumented immigrants, runaway kids, people who didn't matter to the city's leaders. They were buried in the collapse, and when the rescue teams went in, they found phone lines still active. The victims were calling for help, and someone on the other end was hearing them. But the city didn't want the truth to come out, so they cut the lines. And the man who was listening, the telephone operator who heard them die, he went mad. He started hearing voices in the wires, voices that wouldn't stop. And one day, he disappeared. They say he's still out there, still listening, still waiting for someone to answer the phone. They call him the Bellman. Ethan read the entry twice, then 3 times, the words blurring together as his mind struggled to process them. He'd heard stories like this before. Every city had its urban legends, its tales of ghosts and curses and things that went bump in the night. He'd covered enough small-town stories to know that the line between myth and history was often thinner than people liked to admit. But this felt different. This felt like Maya had been trying to tell him something. He turned to the next page. September 5th, I found the station. It's under the Rialto Theater, on Hollow Street. The entrance is hidden behind a false wall in the basement, but it's there. I saw it with my own eyes. There's an old subway station down there, one that's been sealed off since the 1970s. The signs are all still up, and there's a payphone on the platform. I didn't go all the way down. Something stopped me, but I'm going back tomorrow. I have to know what's down there. The notebook entries continued for another dozen pages, each one more urgent than the last. Maya had gone back to the station, had found the payphone, had begun to hear things in the wires. She'd talked to Jonah again, to other people who knew about the Bellman, to a detective named Laura Hayes who seemed to understand more than she was willing to say. And then the entries stopped. Ethan looked at the date on the last page, September 13th, the day before she'd sent him that final text message, the day before she'd disappeared. He closed the notebook and sat in the silence of his sister's apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He should have come sooner. He should have visited, should have answered her calls, should have been here when she needed him. He should have been a better brother. The thought was still burning in his mind when he heard the sound. It came from outside, from somewhere in the darkness below the North Hill projects. A sound that he didn't recognize at first, that took his brain a moment to process because it was so out of place in this dead city. A ringing phone. Ethan stood up, his heart hammering. The sound was coming from the street, from a payphone, a real payphone, one of those old metal boxes that had been disappearing from American streets since the 1990s. He'd seen one at the bottom of the hill, near the entrance to the projects, a relic that had somehow survived the decades. It was ringing. He walked to the window, looked down. The payphone was just visible in the dim light of a flickering street lamp, its metal body glinting with moisture. The receiver was off the hook, swinging gently, and the sound of the ringing seemed to echo through the empty streets. Ethan checked his phone. It was 3:17 a.m. He'd been in Maya's apartment for hours, lost in her notebooks, and he hadn't even noticed the time. The payphone kept ringing. Something made him go downstairs. He didn't know why, didn't want to know why, but his feet were moving before his brain could stop them, carrying him down the concrete stairs and out into the cold September night. The air was damp and heavy, and there was a fog rolling in from the river, the kind of gray, persistent mist that seemed to swallow sound and light and everything else. The street lamp was casting a pool of sickly orange light around the payphone, and as Ethan approached, he could see that the receiver was still swinging gently, as though someone had just hung up. But the phone was still ringing. He picked it up. The voice on the other end was distant, crackling with static, as though it was coming from somewhere far away. But Ethan recognized it instantly. Ethan, his sister's voice. "I'm at Hollow Street," Maya said, her words broken by interference. "I found it. I found the station. But something's wrong. I can't get out. The Bellman knows I'm here." "Maya, where are you?" Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Tell me where you are, and I'll come get you." "You can't," she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like regret. "Not the way you think. It's not that simple. Everything is connected here. The tunnels, the phone lines, the city. The whole city is a memory, Ethan, and the Bellman is making me forget." "Forget what?" "Who I am. What I'm doing here. The more I stay, the less I remember. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. The city doesn't kill you, Ethan. It forgets you first." The static was getting worse, the connection breaking apart. "Maya, wait. Don't let them erase me," she said, and her voice was fading now, growing fainter and fainter. "Promise me, Ethan. Promise you'll remember me." "I promise," he said. "I promise." But he didn't know if she heard him. The line went dead. Ethan stood in the empty street, the receiver pressed to his ear, the silence of Grayford pressing in around him. The fog was thicker now, and the street lamp had begun to flicker, its orange light struggling against the darkness. He looked at the payphone, at its rusted metal body and cracked plastic, at the ancient receiver in his hand. It hadn't rung. It had just been there, waiting, and when he'd picked it up, his sister's voice had come through from somewhere deep beneath the city. He hung up the phone and walked back to Maya's apartment. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in her chair and read her notebooks again and again, trying to understand what she'd found, what she'd been so desperate to uncover. By the time the sun rose over Grayford, he'd made a decision. He was going to find Maya. He was going to find the Bellman. And he was going to make this city remember what it had done. The Grayford Police Department occupied a brutalist building on the corner of 6th and Elm, a concrete box with narrow windows and a front entrance that looked like it had been designed to discourage visitors. A faded sign above the door declared it the Grayford Public Safety Building, but the word safety had lost its final letter somewhere along the way, and the whole thing had the grim, institutional feel of a building that had given up on the pretense of welcoming anyone. Ethan arrived at 8:47 a.m., after a sleepless night spent reading and rereading Maya's notebooks. He'd managed to find Hollow Street on an old map of Grayford. It was near the river, just south of downtown, in an area that had been redeveloped in the 1980s and then abandoned again in the 1990s. The Rialto Theater was on that street, just as Maya's notes had said. But first, he needed to talk to the police. He needed to know what they knew, what they'd done, and why they'd been so slow to act. The reception area was small and uninviting, with plastic chairs bolted to the floor and a bulletproof glass window separating the public from the officers. Behind the glass, a woman with gray-streaked hair and the expression of someone who'd seen too much too often was typing something into a computer. Ethan pressed the buzzer. "I need to speak to someone about a missing persons case." The woman looked up without interest. "Fill out a form." 11 days ago, Ethan said, his voice tighter than he'd intended. "My sister went missing 11 days ago, and I've called 3 times and no one's done anything. Her name is Maya Ward. She lived in the North Hill projects." Something flickered in the woman's expression, recognition, maybe, or the kind of wariness that came from being asked about something you'd rather not discuss. "Wait here," she said. "I'll get Detective Hayes." Detective Laura Hayes appeared 10 minutes later, a woman in her late 40s with the kind of face that had been carved by years of dealing with the worst that humanity had to offer. She was tall and lean, with short dark hair and a careful way of moving that suggested she'd learned to be careful a long time ago. She wore a plain gray suit and carried a coffee cup that looked like it had seen better decades. "Mr. Ward," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Detective Hayes. Let's talk in my office." Her office was small and cluttered, the walls covered with maps and photographs and the kinds of bureaucratic documents that seemed to accumulate in police departments like barnacles on a ship. She gestured to a chair, sat down behind her desk, and regarded him with the kind of careful neutrality that he'd seen in 100 police interviews back when he'd been a journalist. "I understand you've been concerned about your sister," she said. "Maya Ward, age 26, graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh." "Concerned," Ethan said, and he could hear the anger in his voice, the frustration that had been building for 11 days. "She's been missing for 11 days. Her apartment is still full of her things. Her laptop was on her kitchen table. She didn't pack anything. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving, and she hasn't answered her phone since September 14th. What have you done about it?" Hayes didn't flinch. "We've been investigating, Mr. Ward. But the truth is, it's complicated. There's no evidence of a crime. No one saw her leave. No one heard from her after she disappeared. And," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "there's something else." "What?" Hayes opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, thin and unremarkable. She flipped it open, and Ethan could see that it contained a few pages of notes and a single photograph. "Your sister's case was flagged in the system," she said. "Not because of anything she did, but because of something we've seen before. There's been a pattern in Grayford over the last few years. People who go missing, people who seem to vanish without a trace. And in every case, the same thing happens. Their records start to disappear." Hayes slid the folder across the desk. "Your sister's birth certificate, her social security number, her driver's license, they're all still there. But anything related to her work in Grayford has been wiped. Her notes, her interviews, her emails to the University of Pittsburgh, everything connected to her research into the city's history is gone." Ethan stared at her. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean it's like it never existed. The people she interviewed, the sources she was developing, they've all retracted their statements. Some of them are claiming they never met her." Hayes leaned back in her chair, and for the first time, something like unease flickered in her eyes. "I've been on the Grayford PD for 22 years, Mr. Ward. I've seen a lot of strange things, but I've never seen anything quite like this." Ethan thought about the payphone, about his sister's voice coming through the static, about the sound of the Bellman's name in her notebooks. He thought about the way the city seemed to be swallowing her, erasing her, making her disappear from memory as well as from sight. "Detective Hayes," he said, "what do you know about the Bellman?" He watched her expression carefully, and he saw it. A flash of something, recognition or fear or both, quickly suppressed. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "Liar." The word came out harsher than he'd intended, but he didn't take it back. He was tired of people lying to him, tired of the evasions and half-truths that had become the currency of his professional life. His sister was missing, and the people who should have been helping him were doing nothing. "I found Maya's notebooks," he said. "She was researching the 1973 tunnel collapse, the one under downtown. She was talking to people who knew about it, who knew about the Bellman. And then she went down to Hollow Street Station, and she disappeared." Hayes was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "You need to be careful, Mr. Ward. Some stories are better left untold." "That's what they said about the city councilman I investigated in Philadelphia," Ethan said. "And I didn't listen. I should have listened. But this time, it's not about my career. It's about my sister." He stood up, pushed his chair back. "I'm going to Hollow Street Station. I'm going to find out what happened to Maya. And if you're not going to help me, then get out of my way. Mr. Ward, Ethan. My name is Ethan, and I'm going to save my sister." He walked out of the office before she could stop him. The Rialto Theater sat on Hollow Street like a corpse, a pale imitation of the grand movie palaces that had once dotted America's small cities. It had been built in 1927, in the golden age of cinema, and its facade still bore the marks of that vanished era. Art Deco details, a marquee that had once blazed with neon, the ghost of a ticket booth in the entrance. But time had not been kind to the Rialto. The marquee was dark, the letters missing from its sign. The windows were boarded up with plywood that had been painted over so many times it had become a kind of textured gray. The front door was chained shut, and a sign in faded red letters warned that entering this property constitutes trespassing and will result in prosecution. Ethan ignored the sign. He walked around the side of the theater, where an alley led to the back of the building. The alley was littered with broken glass and the remains of a dumpster that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape. The back door was locked, but the lock was old and rusted and gave way after Ethan hit it twice with a rock he found on the ground. Inside, the Rialto smelled of dust and decay and the faint chemical tang of old film. Ethan walked through what had once been the lobby, past the ticket booth, past a concession stand that had been stripped of everything except a single broken popcorn machine. The theater itself was a vast, dark space, its screen gone, its seats reduced to a jumble of rotting wood and rusting metal. But Ethan wasn't interested in the theater itself. He was looking for something else. Behind the screen, in the bowels of the building, he found what he was looking for: a door. It was small and unremarkable, the kind of door that might lead to a storage closet or an electrical room. But there was something about it that caught Ethan's attention. The way the dust seemed to be disturbed around it, the fresh scratches on the lock, the faint crack of light visible at the bottom. He pushed the door open. Beyond it, a staircase led down into darkness. Ethan took out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and began to descend. The stairs were steep and narrow, the kind of stairs that had been built for maintenance workers and hadn't been used in decades. The walls were rough concrete, covered with the remains of old graffiti and the fine gray powder of disintegration. The air was cold and damp, and there was a smell that he couldn't quite identify. Something like ozone, something like rust, something like the memory of electricity. At the bottom of the stairs, a corridor led into the darkness. The corridor was lined with pipes and cables, the arteries of a city that had long since forgotten its own infrastructure. The pipes were rusted, the cables frayed, and the whole thing had the feeling of a place that had been abandoned for so long it had forgotten it was ever meant to be used. Ethan followed the corridor for what felt like 100 yards, maybe more. The phone's flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, creating pools of sickly white light that seemed to make the shadows deeper and more menacing. And then he found it. Hollow Street Station. It was a subway station, but not like any subway station he'd ever seen. The platform was intact, its tiles still gleaming faintly in the light of his phone. The pillars were painted in the old colors of the Grayford Transit Authority, a faded blue with gold trim that seemed almost beautiful in the darkness. The signs were still in place, advertising routes that had ceased to exist decades ago. And on the platform, just as Maya had described, there was a payphone. It was an old one, the kind with a metal housing and a corded receiver, the kind that had been ubiquitous in American cities before the rise of cell phones. It looked like it was still in perfect condition, its metal housing gleaming cleanly, its receiver sitting on the hook as though it was waiting for someone to pick it up. Ethan approached it slowly, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of the station around him, the sense of a place that had been waiting, watching, for a very long time. And then he heard the sound. The payphone was ringing. Ethan stared at it, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing and hearing. The station had been sealed for decades. There was no power, no connection to the outside world. But the phone was ringing, a clear, insistent sound that echoed through the darkness. He reached for the receiver. "Don't." The voice came from behind him, and Ethan spun around, his heart in his throat. There, at the edge of the platform, stood a man. He was old, perhaps 70, with a weathered face and the kind of deep-set eyes that had seen too much too soon. He was wearing a heavy coat that had seen better days, and his hands were shaking slightly as he held them out in a placating gesture. "Don't answer it," the man said. "You answer that phone, you become part of it." Ethan lowered his hand. "Who are you?" The man smiled, a sad, tired expression. "Name's Jonah. Jonah Pike. I used to work the steel mill, back when there was still a steel mill to work. Now I just live. Watch. Try to keep people from making the same mistakes I made." Jonah Pike. The name was familiar from Maya's notebooks. He was the man she'd met at the Route 19 diner, the one who'd told her about the Bellman. "You knew my sister?" Ethan said. Maya. She was here. She came to this station, and she disappeared. Jonah's expression flickered. You're her brother. Yes. I'm sorry, Jonah said. I tried to warn her. I told her to stay away, to leave Grayford and never look back. But she wouldn't listen. Why? Jonah gestured to the payphone. Because she was smart. Smarter than me, smarter than most people. She started to see what was really going on here, the way the city works, the way it eats people and forgets them. He walked toward the payphone, his steps slow and measured. That phone rings at exactly the same time every night. 3:17 a.m. That's when the lines opened up, when the people trapped underneath started calling for help. The 1973 collapse. Yes. Jonah's voice was heavy. They were down there, hundreds of them, maybe more. The city said it was just an industrial accident, a routine tunnel failure. But it wasn't. They buried people alive, and when they started to call for help, the city cut the lines. Who cut them? Jonah looked at him, his eyes glinting in the darkness. Caleb Voss. He was the telephone operator at the Bellwether Exchange. He heard the calls, tried to keep the lines open, but his bosses told him to shut it down, to bury the truth with the dead. He refused, and then he disappeared. Into the tunnels. Yes. Jonah nodded. Caleb couldn't live with what he'd done. He went down into the city beneath the city, into the tunnels where the dead were still calling, and he's been there ever since. He's the Bellman? He's what became of the Bellman, Jonah said. The city took him, same as it takes everyone who refuses to forget. He's the memory Grayford tried to kill, and he's still out there, waiting for someone to answer the phone. Ethan looked at the payphone, still ringing, still insistent. Maya answered it. She did. She thought she could save the dead, bring them back to the surface, make the city remember what it had done. But the Bellman doesn't want to be remembered. He wants to be heard. And once you hear his voice, he won't let you go. But she's alive, Ethan said. I heard her voice on the phone. She told me she was here, that she was trapped. Jonah's expression was troubled. You heard her on the phone? Yes. Last night. 3:17 a.m. That was no accident, Jonah said. The Bellman is using her, just like he uses everyone. He's drawing you in, making you part of his world. And once you're part of it, you can't leave. Ethan shook his head. I don't believe that. My sister is alive, and I'm going to find her. Even if it means forgetting everything you know. One of the rules, Jonah said. There are rules down here, ways to survive. And one of them is this. When you answer the phone, you start to forget. First the small things, then the big ones. Your memories, your history, the people you love. They all start to slip away until you're just a shell, like everyone else down here. Ethan thought about the payphone, about Maya's voice coming through the static, about the way she'd sounded so distant, so disconnected. He thought about her notebooks, the way she'd written that the city forgets you first. She knew, he said. She wrote about it. She knew what she was getting into. She did, Jonah said. She was brave, your sister. Stupid, maybe, but brave. She wanted to bring the truth back, to make Grayford remember it's dead. But the truth is a heavy weight, son, and this city has been carrying it for a long time. He put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You want to save her? Then you need to understand what you're up against. You need to see the city for what it really is. And what's that? A grave, Jonah said. A grave that's still singing. The Grayford Municipal Building was a squat, unlovely structure on the corner of 4th and Main, a product of the 1960s that had been designed with all the aesthetic appeal of a concrete bunker. The lobby was mostly empty, a security guard at a desk, a few people waiting on benches, the smell of old coffee and institutional cleaning products. Detective Laura Hayes was already there, waiting for him. Mr. Ward, she said, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there the day before. I need to speak with you. Ethan had spent the rest of the day with Jonah, learning about the Bellman and the tunnels and the strange rules that governed the city beneath the city. He'd learned about the forgotten, the people who'd been erased from Grayford's memory and now lived in the darkness under the streets. He'd learned about the payphones that rang at 3:17 a.m., the lights that flickered red in the tunnels, the names that appeared on walls and then disappeared. And he'd learned about the detectives who had investigated similar cases and then stopped investigating them, whose memory of the victims had been erased along with the victims themselves. I know why you haven't been able to find Maya, Ethan said. You've tried. You had files on her, interviews, evidence. But every time you try to look into it, the files disappeared, and your memory of the case started to fade. Laura's expression tightened. How did you know that? Because that's what the Bellman does, Ethan said. He erases people. Not just from the city, but from everything. Their birth certificates, their social security numbers, their friends' memories of them. He makes it so they never existed. Laura was silent for a moment, her face unreadable. Then she said, I don't believe in ghosts, Mr. Ward. I've been a cop for 22 years, and I've never seen anything that couldn't be explained by ordinary human evil. Neither had I, Ethan said. But here we are. He sat down across from her, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He'd barely slept in 2 days, and his body was beginning to feel the strain. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't let Maya be erased the way so many others had been. Jonas said something that stuck with me, Ethan said. He said the city is a grave that's still singing. And I think he's right. The tunnel collapse in 1973, the phone lines, the Bellman, it's all connected. The city built its prosperity on the bodies of the people it exploited, and when the dead tried to speak, the city cut off their voices. That's the Bellman. That's what Caleb Voss became. He's the voice of the dead, the memory Grayford tried to kill. Laura studied him for a long moment, and for the first time, he saw something like fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, fear of what he was saying, of the truth he was uncovering. My family's from Grayford, she said, her voice suddenly distant. My grandfather worked for the city. He was involved in the response to the tunnel collapse. He was one of the people who signed off on the cover-up. Ethan stared at her. Your grandfather helped bury the dead? He said it was a matter of public safety, Laura said. He said if the truth came out, the city would lose everything. The mills would close, the jobs would disappear, and thousands of families would be destroyed. He said he was protecting the living. But he was lying. He was terrified, Laura said. They all were. The collapse was worse than anything they'd ever seen. There were people down there, hundreds of them, and they were calling for help. But the city couldn't afford to save them. The liability would have bankrupted the whole region. So they made a choice. To let them die. To let them be forgotten. Laura's voice was barely a whisper. That's what they did. They let the dead be forgotten, and they made the rest of us forget them too. That's been Grayford's secret for 50 years. And now the Bellman is bringing it back. Yes. Laura nodded. The Bellman is the memory that won't die. He's been down there all this time, listening, waiting, and now he's found a way to make the city remember. Through the phones. Through the phones. Laura pulled a file from her briefcase, a thick folder that was covered in dust and labels that Ethan recognized as municipal archive markings. I found this in the basement of the Bellwether Exchange. It's the original transcript of the calls from the tunnel collapse. Ethan took the file, his hands trembling slightly. The pages were yellowed with age, the typing uneven and sometimes smudged. But the words were clear, the voices of the dead transcribed in painstaking detail. Please, someone, we're trapped down here. The tunnel collapsed. We can't get out. Is anyone there? We need help. We need water. We need, oh God, the water is rising. Please, someone, I can't hear you. Please don't leave me. Please don't. There were hundreds of them. Page after page of desperate pleas, of voices that had been ignored and then silenced. And at the end of the transcript, a single line in a different handwriting, a different pen. We have made the difficult decision to terminate the emergency response. The victims' families will be notified as soon as possible. All further rescue efforts are canceled. It was signed by the director of the Grayford Department of Public Works, a name that Ethan recognized from Maya's research as one of the city's most prominent citizens. They left them to die, Ethan said. They buried them alive, Laura said. And then they buried the truth. Ethan looked at the file, at the names of the dead, at the voices that had been silenced. He thought about the Bellman, about Caleb Voss, about the memory that Grayford had tried to kill but couldn't. Where is Maya? He asked. Where would the Bellman take her? Laura was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, if she's still alive, she's somewhere in the tunnels. Somewhere connected to the phone lines. The Bellman is drawn to places where the city's infrastructure is still intact. The stations, the exchanges, the maintenance tunnels. The Hollow Street Station. Yes, but there are others. The Monongahela River Branch, the old freight tunnels, the basements of the buildings that were built over the collapsed sections, and the Bellwether Exchange itself. Ethan nodded slowly. the pieces beginning to fall into place. That's where the Bellman is. That's where Maya is. It's the center of everything. It's the most dangerous place in Grayford, Laura said. If you go there, you might not come back. I don't care, Ethan said. My sister is down there. I'm going to find her. He stood up, the file clutched to his chest. He could feel the weight of the dead pressing on him, the voices that had called out and been ignored. He thought about Maya, about the last text she'd sent him, about the voice on the phone that had asked him to remember her. He would remember everything. As he left the municipal building, the sun was setting over Grayford, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked almost like flames. The city was quiet, the streets empty, the buildings dark. And somewhere beneath it all, the Bellman was waiting. The Route 19 diner stood at the edge of town, a relic of the golden age of American roadside eating that had somehow survived the collapse of the steel industry and the decline of the small city. It was a classic diner, the kind that had been built in the 1950s and never really changed. A long silver structure with chrome trim and neon lettering that still managed to glow despite its age. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars that looked like they'd been there since the Carter administration. Ethan pulled up at 9:17 p.m., his stomach growling. He hadn't eaten in nearly 24 hours, and his body was beginning to remind him of that fact in increasingly insistent ways. But the food wasn't really why he was here. He was here to find Jonah. The diner's interior was everything he'd expected and more. A long counter with red vinyl stools, booths along the windows, a jukebox that was playing something from the 1960s, and the smell of coffee and grease that had been seeping into the walls for the better part of 6 decades. The staff consisted of a waitress in her 50s and a cook who could be seen through the service window, his white apron stained with the history of 1,000 meals. Jonah was sitting in a booth at the back, nursing a cup of coffee and looking like he hadn't moved since Ethan had seen him the day before. He looked up as Ethan approached, and there was something in his expression that suggested he'd been expecting him. "I figured you'd be back," Jonah said. "You've got that look. The look of someone who can't let go." "I found Maya's file," Ethan said, sliding into the booth across from him. Or rather, Detective Hayes found it. "It's from the tunnel collapse. Transcripts of the calls." Jonah nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "I knew about the transcripts. I'd heard rumors for years, but I never saw them myself." "What did they say?" "The dead were calling for help. They were trapped down there, and the water was rising. They begged for someone to come and save them. And no one did. No one did." Ethan leaned forward. "Why, Jonah? Why did the city let them die?" Jonah was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because they were invisible. They were homeless people, undocumented immigrants, runaway kids. People who didn't matter to the people in charge. The city could have saved them, but it would have cost money, and the powers that be decided that money was more important than lives. That's monstrous. That's Grayford." Jonah's voice was heavy with a grief that had clearly been carried for a long time. "The city has been doing this for as long as I can remember. It uses people up, and when they're no longer useful, it erases them. The Bellman is just the latest version of that." "But the Bellman isn't the city," Ethan said. "He's something else. He's the voice of the dead, the memory Grayford tried to kill." "He's what happens when you let a city's sins fester," Jonah said. "The dead don't stay silent forever, Ethan. They find a way to speak." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, trying to process everything he'd learned. The Bellman was a symptom of something larger, a disease that had infected Grayford for decades. Maya had been trying to expose that disease, to force the city to confront its past, and the disease had swallowed her. She was brave, Ethan said. Stupid, maybe, but brave. She knew what she was getting into, and she went in anyway. She was trying to set the dead free, Jonah said. That was what she believed she could do. The city has been keeping the dead imprisoned for 50 years, and she thought she could break the walls down. But she couldn't. Not alone. Jonah's eyes were sharp, seeing something Ethan couldn't quite grasp. But maybe not alone. Ethan looked at him, a new understanding dawning. You're saying I can help her. I'm saying the Bellman is a force of memory, Jonah said. And memory is powerful. If enough people remember the dead, the Bellman's grip weakens. That's what your sister was trying to do. She was trying to make the city remember the people it had erased. How do I do that? Jonah leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. You need to go to the Bellwether Exchange. That's the heart of it, the place where it all began. There's a switchboard down there, the original one. If you can activate it, you can bring the dead back, force the city to remember. Ethan thought about the building, the massive red brick structure on the corner of Main and Harrison. He'd passed it a dozen times over the years, never giving it a second thought. But now he saw it differently, as the center of a conspiracy that had lasted half a century, a monument to everything Grayford had done to bury its shame. "When do I go?" Now Jonas said. "The Bellman is strongest at night, but he's weakest at the threshold. At midnight, the lines between things blur. If you go at midnight, you might be able to reach the switchboard before he knows you're there." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'll do it." "Ethan." Jonah's voice was urgent. "There's something else you need to know. The Bellman is not just a ghost. He's not a spirit or a demon. He's a man who was broken by what he was forced to do. Caleb Voss loved the city, loved it with all his heart. And when the city forced him to abandon the dead, it shattered something inside him. He became the Bellman because he couldn't bear the silence. He wants to be heard. He wants the truth to be known," Jonas said. "That's the only thing that can heal him. That's the only thing that can save Maya." Ethan stood up, his mind made up. He would go to the Bellwether Exchange, find the switchboard, and make the city remember its dead. It was the only way to save his sister. "Wait," Jonas said. "There's something else. You're not going to be able to do this alone. You need someone who knows the building, knows the tunnels. You need someone who's been down there before." "Who?" Jonas smiled, a sad, tired expression. "That's where I come in." The Bellwether Telephone Exchange loomed in the darkness, its red brick facade glowing faintly under the light of a single street lamp. The building was silent, its windows dark, its doors locked. But Ethan could feel something emanating from it, a vibration that hummed through the pavement and into his bones. "You feel it, don't you?" Jonas said, his voice barely a whisper. "The hum. The Bellman is awake tonight." Ethan nodded. He could feel it, a strange, low-frequency pulse that seemed to come from deep within the earth, as though the building itself was breathing. "How do we get in?" "There's an entrance on the side," Jonas said. "The old service door. It's locked, but I know how to get it open." They walked along the side of the building, past windows that were covered with metal grates, past a fire escape that had been rusted into immobility. The service door was small and unremarkable, its paint peeling away to reveal the original metal beneath. Jonah pulled a set of keys from his pocket, keys that looked like they'd been scavenged from a dozen different locks, none of them matching. But he found the right one, and the door swung open with a groan of old hinges. The interior of the Bellwether Exchange was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp through the grimy windows. The lobby was a vast, open space that had once been the main public area of the exchange, its marble floors now cracked and dusty, its walls covered with faded murals that depicted the glory days of American telecommunications. "This used to be the central hub for the entire region," Jonas said, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "Every call that went through Grayford, every connection, every conversation, it all went through this building. And now it's a tomb." They moved through the building, past switchboards that had been silent for decades, past offices that had been stripped bare of everything except memories. The hum was getting stronger, pulsing through the floor like a heartbeat. "The switchboard is in the basement," Jonas said. "But we can't get there from here. The old elevator's been sealed off. We need to go through the tunnels." "The tunnels?" "The city's utility tunnels," Jonas said. "They run under the whole downtown area, connecting the exchange to the station to everything else. That's how the Bellman moves. That's how he stayed hidden all these years." Ethan followed Jonah through a door at the back of the lobby, down a narrow staircase that led into the basement. The basement was dark and dusty, filled with old equipment and forgotten machinery. At the back of the space, there was a metal door, its surface covered with warnings and symbols that Ethan didn't recognize. "This is the entrance to the tunnels," Jonas said. "Beyond this door, you're in the Bellman's world. If you're not ready for that, turn back now." "I'm ready," Ethan said. Jonah nodded, pulling another key from his collection. The door swung open, revealing a dark corridor that stretched into the distance. The walls were covered in grime and moisture, and the air was damp and cold. "Stay close to me," Jonas said. "And whatever you do, don't touch the pipes." They descended into the darkness. The tunnels were older than the city above them, catacombs of industry that had been carved into the earth decades before the buildings were built. The pipes were enormous, carrying steam and water and who knew what else through the body of the city. The floor was wet, and the walls were covered with a kind of moss that glowed faintly in the darkness. And everywhere, there were phones. They hung from the walls at intervals, attached to the pipes, attached to the ceiling. Some were old, their metal housings rusted and forgotten. Others were newer, their plastic shells gleaming cleanly in the dim light. The Bellman uses them to communicate, Jonas said. Every phone in Grayford is connected to him. He can speak through any of them, listen through all of them. Ethan tried not to look at the phones, tried not to imagine the voices that might speak through them, but he couldn't help himself. He found himself glancing at each one as they passed, half expecting to hear it ring. And then it happened. The phone nearest to him rang. "Don't answer it," Jonas said, his voice sharp. But Ethan couldn't help himself. He reached for the receiver. And then he heard the voice. "Ethan, remember me." It was Maya, and she was dying. "We need to keep moving," Jonas said, pulling Ethan away from the phone. "The Bellman is trying to trap you. If you answer, you'll be lost forever." Ethan tore himself away from the phone, his heart racing, his mind spinning. He'd heard his sister's voice, really heard it, and the sound of her fear and pain was like a knife in his chest. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Where is the Bellman keeping her?" "I don't know," Jonas said, "but I know how to find out." They moved faster, deeper into the tunnels. The phones continued to ring, their sound echoing through the darkness like a chorus of ghosts. Ethan covered his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was impossible. The ringing was everywhere, coming from every direction, and with it came the voices. "Please, someone help us. We're trapped down here, and the water is rising. I can hear you. Please don't leave me." It was the same voices from the transcript, the same desperate pleas that had been ignored 50 years ago. They were calling out again, calling for help, calling for someone to remember. "I hear them," Ethan said. "They're all around us." "The dead never really leave," Jonas said. "They just get quieter, until someone listens." They reached a junction in the tunnels, a point where 3 corridors met. At the center of the junction, there was a telephone switchboard, a small one, like the kind that might have been used in a small business or a private home. It was connected to the pipes, its wires snaking into the walls and ceiling. "This is it," Jonas said. "This is where the Bellman makes his calls. If we can trace the lines from here, we can find Maya." He began to work on the switchboard, connecting wires, activating circuits that hadn't been used in decades. Ethan watched, his heart pounding, as the old equipment slowly came to life. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, Ethan heard something else. A new sound. A bell. It was small and clear, the sound of a single chime that seemed to cut through the chaos of the ringing phones. And with it, Ethan realized what had happened. The Bellman knew they were here, and he was coming for them. Laura Hayes was sitting in her car, watching the bellwether exchange from a safe distance. She'd been there for hours, ever since she'd left Ethan at the Route 19 diner. She knew what he was planning, knew he was going to try to enter the building and find the switchboard. But she also knew what was waiting for him inside. The Bellman. She'd seen the Bellman once, years ago, before she'd fully understood what was happening in Grayford. It had been a cold February night, and she'd been called to investigate a report of strange noises coming from the old Bellwether building. She'd gone in alone, expecting nothing more than vandals or homeless people. Instead, she'd found the Bellman. He had been standing in the darkness of the exchange's lobby, his face hidden in shadows. But she'd seen his eyes, bright and burning with a terrible intelligence. And she'd heard his voice, a low, resonant hum that seemed to resonate through her entire body. "You don't belong here," he'd said. "But you've seen me now, and you can't unsee me." She'd backed away, out of the building, and she hadn't returned. But she'd never been able to forget what she'd seen. She'd never been able to forget the Bellman. Now, watching the exchange from her car, she was beginning to wonder if she'd made the right choice. Ethan was in there, and so was the Bellman. And the Bellman wasn't going to let Ethan leave without a fight. She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a folder. The same folder she'd shown Ethan earlier, the one containing the transcript of the calls from the tunnel collapse. She'd found something else in that folder, something she hadn't told Ethan about. A photograph. It was old, yellowed with age, showing a group of men in hard hats standing in front of what appeared to be a rescue operation. The men were grim-faced, and at the center of the photo, there was a figure in a telephone operator's uniform. the uniform of the Bellwether Exchange. Caleb Voss. He was young in the photograph, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair and a serious expression. He was holding a telephone receiver, and his face was turned slightly, as though he was listening for something. Laura had recognized him immediately, not from the photograph itself, but from the images that appeared in her mind when she saw it. The Bellman's face, the one she'd glimpsed in the darkness of the exchange, was the same face. Caleb Voss was the Bellman. She'd known it on some level, but seeing the photograph made it real. The man who had listened to the dead, the man who had been shattered by what he'd heard, was still alive. Or something like alive. She put the photograph back in the folder and got out of the car. She was going to help Ethan, whether he wanted her help or not. The service door was open, just as Ethan had said it would be. Laura stepped into the exchange, her hand on her weapon. It was pitch black inside. She turned on her flashlight, sweeping the beam across the lobby, the walls, the floor. There was no sign of Ethan, no sign of anyone. But there was a sound, a faint humming, like the sound of 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. It was coming from below, from the basement. Laura followed the sound. The staircase was narrow and steep, its steps covered in debris. She descended slowly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. And then she found him. Ethan was standing in front of a switchboard, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the equipment. He was holding a receiver, and his expression was one of terrible concentration. "What are you doing?" Laura said, her voice cutting through the silence. Ethan turned to her, his eyes wide. "I'm trying to reach Maya. She's down there. I can hear her through the lines." Laura looked at the switchboard, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. The wires were moving, twisting of their own accord, as though something was directing them. "He's using the switchboard to trap you," she said. "You need to let go of the receiver." "I can't," Ethan said. "If I let go, she'll be lost forever." "Ethan, please." And then the line went dead. Ethan lowered the receiver, his face pale and drawn. He cut the connection. "He's toying with me." Laura moved to the switchboard, examining the wires. "These are the original lines from the tunnel collapse. The Bellman is connected to them. If we can trace them, we can find Maya." She began to work, connecting wires, checking the old equipment. It was a delicate operation, one that required patience and skill. But she'd been a detective for 22 years, and she knew how to follow a trail. "The lines lead to the Monongahela River branch," she said finally. "That's where she is. That's where the Bellman is." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then that's where I'm going." "Ethan, wait. I don't have time to wait. My sister is in danger, and I'm the only one who can save her. If you want to help me, then come with me." Laura hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "Lead the way." They moved quickly through the tunnels, following the lines that snaked along the walls and ceilings. The phones were ringing again, their sound echoing through the darkness like the calls of the dead. And then they were there. The Monongahela River branch was a section of the utility tunnels near the river, a place where the city's infrastructure had been abandoned decades earlier. The walls were wet, and the floor was covered in an inch of water. The air was cold and still, and there was a smell of decay that seemed to hang over everything. At the end of the tunnel, Ethan could see something. A figure, hunched over, clutching a telephone receiver. Ethan moved forward, his steps careful, his heart pounding. The Bellman was smaller than he'd expected, a frail-looking figure in a dark coat that had seen better years. His face was in shadow, hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. But his hands were moving, twisting the wires of the switchboard with a frantic energy. "Maya," Ethan said, his voice a whisper. "Where's Maya?" The Bellman turned to him slowly, and Ethan saw his face for the first time. It was pale and gaunt, with sunken eyes and hollow cheeks. But there was something familiar about it, something that Ethan had seen before, in old photographs and faded memories. "It's been a long time," the Bellman said, his voice rusty from disuse. "I've been waiting for you." The Rialto Theater had been abandoned for decades, its once grand facade now a crumbling testament to the city's decline. But tonight, it was alive with activity. Ethan and Laura made their way through the theater's basement, following the signs that Maya had left behind, the markers that pointed toward the entrance to the Hollow Street station. The door was heavy, metal, and locked. But Jonah had given them a key, the same key that he'd used to enter the Bellwether Exchange. It worked, and the door swung open onto a staircase that descended into darkness. This is it, Ethan said. The Hollow Street station. He stepped onto the staircase, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The steps were steep and narrow, and the air was cold and damp. He could feel the presence of the Bellman, the weight of his attention, like a physical pressure on his skin. He knows we're here, Laura said. He's waiting for us. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. He was about to meet the Bellman, to confront the man who had stolen his sister. He didn't know what would happen, but he knew one thing. He would not leave without Maya. The staircase led to a large chamber, an old subway station that had been sealed off for decades. The platform was intact, its tiles gleaming faintly in the light of Ethan's flashlight. The pillars were covered with old advertisements, faded posters that advertised products and services that no longer existed. And on the platform, there was a payphone. It was old, a classic American payphone with a metal housing and a corded receiver. It was gleaming, polished, as though it had been maintained by someone who cared. The Bellman's phone, Ethan said. The one he uses to communicate. He walked toward it, his steps echoing through the empty station. The phone was silent, its receiver resting on the hook. But Ethan could feel it watching him, waiting for him. He picked up the receiver. There was silence. And then, from the other end, a voice. Ethan, you came. It was Maya. Her voice was faint, distant, but it was her. Maya, where are you? I'm coming to get you. You can't get me, Ethan. Not like this. The Bellman has me, and he won't let me go. You need to find the switchboard, the one at the Bellwether Exchange. That's where the connection is, where the dead are calling. If you activate it, you can break the spell. Ethan listened closely and realized that the connection between the phone and the station was there. How do I activate it? There's a code, a sequence of connections. It's inscribed on the walls of the exchange, hidden in the murals. The Bellman knew about it, knew what it could do. That's why he was there, to protect the secret. Ethan turned to Laura, his eyes blazing. We need to find that code. The Bellman's at the exchange, and that's where we need to go. Laura nodded. Let's go. They left the station, made their way back to the Rialto, back to the city above. The streets were empty, the city silent. But Ethan could feel the Bellman's presence, could feel his attention like a weight on his chest. You can't escape me, the voice said. I am everywhere. Ethan pushed forward, determined. He would find the code, he would activate the switchboard, and he would save his sister. The Hollow Street station was larger than Ethan had expected, a vast underground chamber that had been carved out of the city's bedrock. The platform stretched into the distance, its tiles gleaming faintly in the dim light. The pillars were covered in old advertisements, faded posters that had once been beautiful and now were just ghosts. But there was something else here, something that didn't belong. In the center of the platform, there was a switchboard. It was old, a classic telephone switchboard with rows of jacks and plugs. It was connected to the phone lines that snaked along the walls and ceilings, the lines that had been used to communicate with the dead. This is it, Laura said. This is where the Bellman makes his calls. Ethan moved toward the switchboard, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of the dead pressing on him, the voices that had called out and been ignored. They were here, in this station, waiting for someone to listen. He approached the switchboard. It was covered in dust, its wires tangled and broken. But there was something about it, something that called to him, that whispered in his ear. Don't you want to know the truth? The voice said. Don't you want to hear what they said? Ethan reached for the switchboard, his fingers trembling. And then he heard it, the sound of a phone ringing. It was coming from the payphone on the platform, the old metal housing that had been polished to a gleaming shine. The receiver was off the hook, swinging gently, and the sound of the ringing seemed to echo through the empty station. Ethan walked toward the phone, his steps slow and deliberate. The ringing grew louder, more insistent. And then he picked up the receiver. He heard his sister's voice. She was in pain, calling out to him. Ethan, please, help me. I'm coming, Maya, he said. I'm coming for you. He put the receiver down, turned to Laura, his eyes blazing. We need to go to the Bellwether Exchange. That's where Maya is. That's where the Bellman is. Laura looked at him, her expression unreadable. Ethan, you don't know what you're getting into. The Bellman is not just a man. He's something else, something more. If you go to him, you might never come back. I don't care, Ethan said. My sister is down there. I'm going to save her, no matter the cost. He turned, began to walk toward the exit. And then he heard it, the sound of a door slamming shut. The exit was blocked, sealed off by a heavy metal door that had appeared from nowhere. Ethan tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. And then he heard the voice, the same voice that had been haunting him since his arrival. "You can't escape me, Ethan. You're mine now." The bellman was here, in the station, watching him. Ethan turned, his heart pounding, and saw him. The bellman was standing at the end of the platform, his face hidden in shadow. He was holding a telephone receiver, and his voice echoed through the darkness. "You came looking for your sister. You found me instead, and now you're trapped, just like she was." Ethan was paralyzed, unable to move. And then, the bellman began to walk toward him. The tunnels beneath Grayford were like a labyrinth, a maze of corridors and chambers that had been built and abandoned over the decades. Ethan and Laura moved through them carefully, following the faint sound of the bellman's voice as it echoed through the darkness. "This is where they live," Laura said, her voice low. "The forgotten. The people the city has erased." Ethan nodded. He'd read about them in Maya's notebooks, heard about them from Jonah. They were the survivors of the bellman's attacks, the people who had been erased from memory but still lived. "I can't hear them," Ethan said, his voice a whisper. "The voices of the forgotten." Laura listened, and she heard them too. They were faint, like echoes in a distant canyon, but they were there. The voices of the dead, the people who had been buried alive and then forgotten. "Someone help us. We're still here, still waiting." Ethan followed the voices, his steps moving faster. He knew they were leading him to Maya, knew that the bellman was using them to draw him deeper into the tunnels. And then, from the darkness, he heard a new voice. "Ethan, please, don't leave me." It was Maya. She was close, just around the corner, in a chamber that had been sealed off for decades. Ethan rounded the corner and found her. She was standing in the middle of the chamber, her face pale and drawn. Her hands were bound, her ankles bound, and in her eyes, there was a fear so deep that it had turned to resignation. "Maya," Ethan said, rushing to her. "I'm here. I've got you." But Maya shook her head, her eyes full of tears. "You can't save me, Ethan. Not like this. The bellman is here, and he won't let me go." And then Ethan heard it, the sound of a phone ringing. It was coming from the center of the chamber, from a payphone that had been placed on a small pedestal. The receiver was off the hook, and the sound of the ringing echoed through the darkness. "The bellman's phone," Maya said, her voice a whisper. "That's how he communicates, how he controls things." And heard the bellman's voice. "Ethan Ward, you've come a long way to die." The bellman's words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan was in the tunnels now, deep beneath Grayford, surrounded by the forgotten dead and the darkness that had swallowed his sister. "I'm not here to die," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm here to save Maya. There is no saving her." The bellman's voice echoed from the phone. "She's part of the forgotten now. She's been erased from history, from memory. The only thing that remains of her is her voice, trapped in these wires, waiting to be heard." Ethan clenched his fists. "She's not trapped. She's here, and I'm going to take her back with me." "You cannot take her back. The city has forgotten her, and so has the world. She's now a ghost, a shadow of what she once was. If you try to force her to leave, she'll cease to exist entirely." Ethan turned to Maya. She was still standing in the corner of the chamber, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression one of despair. "You heard him," Maya said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't leave. Not anymore." Ethan shook his head, refusing to believe. "There's got to be a way. The switchboard, the code. I can use it to break the spell." "The code is inscribed on the walls of the Bellwether Exchange," the bellman said. "But only the bellman can read it. And the bellman is not inclined to share his secrets." Ethan felt a surge of determination. "Then I'll find it myself, and I'll use it to bring Maya back." He turned to leave, but as he walked toward the exit, he heard something that made his blood run cold. "Ethan, don't go." It was Maya's voice. She was pleading, begging for him to stay. He turned back to look at her, and saw that the shadows were gathering around her, dark and menacing, ready to swallow her forever. Ethan had been away from the North Hill projects for less than a day, but when he returned, it was as if his sister had never lived there at all. The apartment was empty. All of Maya's belongings were gone. Her books, her clothes, her laptop, her notebooks. The walls were bare, the floors swept clean, the closets and cupboards devoid of any sign that anyone had ever lived there. Ethan stood in the center of the apartment, his mind reeling. He'd been here just a few hours ago, holding Maya's notebooks, reading her words. Now there was nothing at all, no evidence that Maya had ever existed. "She's been erased," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Jonah appeared in the doorway, his face grim. It started. "The Bellman is making Maya disappear from the city's memory. If he succeeds, she'll be as forgotten as all the others who were buried in the tunnels." Ethan sank to his knees, the weight of the loss pressing down on him. He'd failed Maya, failed to protect her from the Bellman's curse. And now she was gone, erased from existence. Nothing but a memory that was already fading. "Wait," Jonah said. "Maybe she's not gone." Ethan looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "Listen," Jonah said. "The Bellman's powers are tied to Grayford's memory. If the city forgets someone, they cease to exist. But if the city remembers them, if the people who care about them remember them, they can survive. Your sister isn't gone yet. She's just fading." Ethan got to his feet, his determination renewed. "Then I'll make the city remember her. I'll make everyone remember her, no matter what it costs." Jonah nodded. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." The St. Orzan Medical Center was a labyrinth of abandoned wards and darkened corridors, a place where the forgotten dead had been treated and then forgotten themselves. Ethan and Laura had made their way to the hospital in search of answers, following a lead that had appeared in Maya's notebooks. "The tunnels beneath the hospital," Ethan said, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "That's where the Bellman has his main switchboard." Laura nodded. "I've heard rumors about it. The patients who died in the tunnels, the ones who were never identified, their records are down there, buried in the basement with everything else." They made their way to the basement, the stairwell dark and steep, the air cold and damp. At the bottom, they found a door marked Maintenance Tunnels, authorized personnel only. "This is it," Ethan said. He pushed open the door and stepped into the darkness. The tunnels beneath St. Orzan were unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. They were older than the hospital itself, catacombs that had been carved into the earth centuries ago, expanded and modified over the years to accommodate the city's growing infrastructure. The walls were lined with pipes and cables, and the floor was littered with debris that had accumulated over the decades. "Wait," Laura said, her voice low. "Do you hear that?" Ethan listened. There was a sound, faint but growing louder. It was a ringing, the sound of a telephone. "It's coming from down there," Laura said, pointing to a door at the end of the corridor. Ethan moved toward the door, pushing it open. The room beyond was filled with old telephone equipment, switchboards, connectors, wires that had been tangled and forgotten. And in the center of the room, there was a telephone, its receiver lying on the floor, its chime clear. "There's the switchboard," Ethan said. "The Bellman switchboard." He walked toward it, his heart pounding. The ringing grew louder, more insistent, as if the phone was trying to get his attention. And then he heard a voice, a familiar voice. "Ethan, you're close." "Maya," but there was no answer. The line went dead. Ethan reached the switchboard. It was covered in dust, but its connections were still intact, its wires still humming with a faint electrical charge. He could feel the power emanating from it, the power of the dead who were trapped in the wires, waiting for someone to listen. "The switchboard is active," he said. "The Bellman is using it to contact the dead." Laura moved to join him, her face pale in the dim light. "Can you use it to reach Maya?" "I can try." Ethan touched the switchboard, and then he felt something, a presence that seemed to fill the room. The Bellman was here, and he was not alone. The Bellwether Telephone Exchange was a monument to a forgotten era, a building that had once connected the city to the world. Now it was a tomb, a place where the dead called out through the wires and the living had forgotten how to listen. Ethan and Laura entered through the service door, the one that Jonah had showed them. The lobby was dark, the reception desk abandoned, the walls covered in faded advertisements for telephone services that no longer existed. "We need to find the switchboard," Ethan said. "The main one, the one that controls everything." Laura nodded, leading the way through the building. They moved through corridors of empty offices, past rows of cubicles that had been stripped clean, past service closets that had been boarded up for decades. And then they found it. The main switchboard was in the center of the building, a massive structure of metal and wires that rose 2 stories high. It was covered in dust, its connections dark and silent. "This is it," Laura said. "This is where it all began." Ethan approached the switchboard, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of the dead pressing on him, the voices that had been calling out for 50 years. They were there, in the wires, in the connections, waiting for someone to listen. He reached out, touched the switchboard, and felt a surge of energy flow through him. For a moment, he saw everything. The tunnel collapse, the desperate calls for help, the decision to cut the lines and let the dead be forgotten. He saw Caleb Voss, the young telephone operator, listening to the dying voices, trying to save them. He saw the city's officials, cold and calculating, ordering the lines cut to protect their secrets. He saw the Bellman being born, the transformation of a broken man into something else, something that existed in the spaces between memory and forgetting. And then he heard her voice. "Ethan, please. I'm here. Maya." She was there, somewhere in the switchboard, connected to the wires. And she was fading, losing the connection to the world above. "I'm coming for you," Ethan said. "I'm not going to let you go." He began to work, connecting the wires, activating the connections that had been dormant for decades. He was going to break the spell that held Maya captive, no matter what it cost. And then he heard the Bellman's voice, cold and menacing. "You cannot save her, Ethan. She is already mine." The Bellwether Exchange was a maze of corridors and connections, a place where the dead had been trapped and the living had been erased. Ethan moved through the building quickly, his hands trembling from the revelation that Maya was still alive, connected to the phone lines that the Bellman used to communicate with the dead. "Where is she?" Ethan demanded, turning to Laura. "The connection is still active. Where is the line that leads to her?" Laura was studying a map on the wall, a faded document that showed the layout of Grayford's telecommunications infrastructure. "There's a junction box in the basement, near the old freight tunnels. That's where the lines from the tunnel collapse converge, connecting the dead to the exchange." The Bellman's main switchboard. Ethan moved toward the basement stairs, his steps urgent. "We have to get there before the Bellman cuts the connection." The basement of the Bellwether Exchange was damp and cold, its walls covered in grime and moisture. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decaying wires. At the center of the space, there was a switchboard, massive and ancient, its connections humming with a faint electrical charge. "This is it," Laura said. "This is where the lines converge." Ethan approached the switchboard, his heart pounding. He could hear the voices now, the desperate pleas of the dead, the cries for help that had been ignored for 50 years. They were calling out to him, begging for him to listen. "Help us. Please, someone hear us. We're still here, we've always been here." Ethan reached out and touched the switchboard. And then the switchboard lit up, its connections flickering to life, its wires humming with a power that had been dormant for decades. And then, from the other end of the switchboard, a voice spoke to him. "Ethan, you found me." It was Maya. She was there, connected to the lines, her voice clear and strong. "I've got you," Ethan said. "I'm not going to let go. The Bellman is coming. You have to be quick." Ethan worked quickly, connecting the wires, activating the connections that had been dormant for decades. He could feel the power of the dead, the energy of the forgotten, flowing through him. They were helping him, guiding him, giving him the strength he needed. And then the Bellman was there. He appeared in the doorway, his figure dark and menacing. His face was hidden in shadow, but Ethan could see his eyes, burning with a cold, terrible intelligence. "You cannot save her," the Bellman said. "She is part of the forgotten now. She belongs to the city beneath the city." Ethan shook his head, his hands still working the switchboard. "She belongs to me, and I'm taking her back. You will fail. We'll see." Ethan made the final connection. There was a flash of light, a surge of energy that shook the entire building. And then the switchboard went dark. Maya was gone. The connection was broken. Ethan felt a surge of despair. Had he failed? Had he been too late? But then he heard her voice, faint and distant. "I'm still here, Ethan. You saved me." Ethan breathed a sigh of relief. Maya was alive, still connected, still in Grayford. But she was still trapped in the tunnels, still waiting for him to come and bring her back. "The connection is broken," Ethan said, "but she's still here." Laura nodded. "We need to find her. Before the Bellman does." They moved quickly, following the lines, searching for the source of Maya's voice. And then they found it. The junction box was in the center of the basement, a metal cabinet that had been sealed for decades. Ethan opened it, revealing a tangle of wires and connections. "Can you reconnect her?" Laura asked. Ethan nodded. his hands working quickly. He could feel the Bellman's presence, could feel him pushing back, trying to prevent him from completing the connection. And then the connection was complete. Maya's voice was clear and strong, reaching out through the lines. "Ethan, I'm here. I've got you," Ethan said. "I'll never let you go." The University of Pittsburgh's Urban Studies Department was housed in a building on the edge of campus, a blocky structure of concrete and glass that had been designed in the 1960s and never renovated. Ethan had driven there as soon as he'd realized what Maya had been trying to uncover. Now, sitting in a cramped office with a stack of Maya's research, he was beginning to understand the full scope of what she'd been working on. The Bellman wasn't just a ghost story, he realized. He was the embodiment of a much larger phenomenon, a symptom of a city's refusal to confront its own history. The dead didn't disappear because they died. They disappeared because the city had chosen to forget them, to erase them from history. He read through Maya's thesis, her words describing how urban legends could be used to preserve forgotten histories, how communities could use storytelling to process trauma and grief. She wrote about Grayford's tunnel collapse, the way the city had chosen to bury the truth along with the dead. And then, at the end of the document, he found something that made his blood run cold. A name, Caleb Voss. Maya had identified him as the man behind the Bellman legend. He'd been a telephone operator at the Bellwether Exchange, and he'd heard the voices of the dying. But there was more. Maya had also discovered that Caleb Voss had tried to reveal the truth, had tried to expose the city's cover-up. But he'd failed, and the city had erased him. And that was how the Bellman was born. Ethan closed the file, his hands trembling. The Bellman wasn't a monster. He was a victim, a man who had been broken by what he'd seen and heard. But that didn't change what he'd done. He'd stolen Maya, erased her from the city's memory, and Ethan was going to get her back. Laura Hayes had always known that her family had secrets, but she'd never realized how deep they went until she started digging into the tunnel collapse. The records were in her grandfather's attic, a dusty old box that had been sealed for decades. Inside, she'd found letters, photographs, documents that told the full story of what had happened in 1973. Her grandfather, Arthur Hayes, had been the deputy director of the Grayford Department of Public Works. He'd been present at the meeting where the decision had been made to cut the phone lines and let the dead be forgotten. He'd signed off on the cover-up, along with half a dozen other city officials. But Arthur Hayes had never been able to forget what he'd done. The letters, written in his own hand, were full of guilt and remorse. He'd spent the rest of his life trying to atone for his crime, donating money to the families of the victims, trying to expose the truth. And then, one day, he'd disappeared. Laura had always thought her grandfather had died in a car accident. But the letters told a different story. Arthur Hayes had gone to the Bellwether Exchange, determined to tell the truth. But the Bellman had been waiting for him. "I'm sorry," Arthur had written in his final letter. "I thought I could make it right. But some things can't be fixed. Some sins can't be forgiven." Laura put down the letter, her hands trembling. Her grandfather had tried to do the right thing, and the Bellman had killed him. She knew what she had to do. She had to help Ethan finish what Arthur had started. The tunnels of Grayford were a maze of darkness and fear. Ethan and Laura moved through them, searching for Maya, aware that the Bellman was hunting them. "Ethan, where are you?" Maya's voice echoed through the darkness, faint and distant. Ethan followed it, his heart pounding, his steps quick and urgent. But the Bellman was always there, just ahead of them, always one step ahead. "You can't escape me," the Bellman's voice echoed. "I am everywhere. I am the city." Ethan ignored him, pushing forward. He could feel Maya's presence, could feel her calling out to him. She was close, just around the corner, waiting for him. But when he turned the corner, the Bellman was there. He was wearing a dark coat, his face hidden in shadow. But his voice was clear, cold, and menacing. "You cannot save her, Ethan. She is part of the forgotten now, part of the city beneath the city. If you take her back, you will destroy the balance." Ethan shook his head, his determination unbroken. "I don't care about the balance. I care about my sister. Your sister is already dead. She just doesn't know it yet." The Bellman raised his hand, and the shadows began to move, closing in around Ethan and Laura. But Ethan had a secret weapon. He'd read about it in Maya's thesis, a way to fight the Bellman. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph of Maya. A recent photograph, one that showed her alive and happy. "If the city forgets her," Ethan said, Then I'll make the city remember. I'll show everyone who she is, what she means to me." He held up the photograph, and the shadows began to recede, retreating from the light of Maya's image. The bellman howled in rage, his voice echoing through the tunnel. "She is mine." But the shadows were gone. The bellman's power had been broken. Ethan turned to Laura. "Let's go. We need to find Maya before the bellman recovers." The center of the bellwether exchange was the first switchboard, a massive structure of metal and wires that had been the heart of Grayford's telecommunications network for decades. Ethan and Laura found themselves in the room, surrounded by the hum of 1,000 connections. "This is where the bellman's power originates," Laura said. "If we can sever the connections, we can free Maya and all the other forgotten." Ethan moved to the switchboard, his hands trembling. He could feel the dead pressing in on him, feel their desperation and their pain. They were everywhere in the wires, the connections, the circuits. He began to disconnect the wires, one by one. With each disconnect, a voice fell silent, a lost soul freed from its torment. And then, in the middle of the switchboard, he found a single line. A line that was still active, still connected. He hesitated. If he disconnected her line, she would die. But if he left it connected, she would remain trapped in the bellman's realm. He made his decision. He reached for the line, his fingers trembling. And then he heard a voice. "Ethan, thank you." It was Maya's voice, faint and distant, full of acceptance. "I'm not going to give up on you," Ethan said. "I'm going to save you." But Maya shook her head. "You can't, Ethan. Not this way. The only way to save me is to let me go." Ethan hesitated, his hands shaking. And then he disconnected the line. The connection was broken. Maya was gone. For a moment, Ethan felt nothing but despair. He'd failed. He'd let her go, and now she was truly gone. "I'm free, Ethan. Thank you." She was gone, but she was free. The shadow world beneath Grayford was a nightmare, a distorted version of the city above. Ethan had found Maya in a strange place, a version of Grayford that was both familiar and alien. Maya was alive, but she was lost. She'd been in the shadow world for so long that she'd started to forget herself, to forget who she'd been, to forget that she'd ever existed. "I came here to save you," Ethan said, reaching for her. But Maya stepped back, her eyes fearful. "You can't save me. I'm too far gone. I don't even remember who I am anymore." "Then let me help you remember," Ethan said. "I know who you are, Maya. You're my sister. You're the one who never gave up, who always believed in justice. You came here because you wanted to help the forgotten, to give them a voice." Maya looked at him, her expression uncertain. And then, slowly, she began to remember. She remembered her childhood, growing up with Ethan in Grayford. She remembered her parents, her friends, her dreams. She remembered why she'd come here, what she'd been trying to do. "I was trying to set them free," she said, her voice trembling. "The forgotten, the ones the bellman had trapped. And you succeeded," Ethan said. "You freed them. Now it's time to let yourself be free." Maya hesitated, and then she nodded. "Okay, let me go." Ethan reached for her, and she took his hand. The shadow world began to dissolve around them, melting away like mist in the morning sun. And then Maya was gone. The city of Grayford had been asleep for a long time, but now it was beginning to wake up. The tunnels beneath the city were sealed, the bellman's power broken. But the dead still had a voice, and the survivors were beginning to speak. Ethan had done it. He'd saved Maya, freed the forgotten, and forced the city to remember its dead. But the cost had been high. He'd lost his sister, lost the life he'd known. But he'd gained something too, a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. He went back to Maya's apartment, now empty and cold. But he could still feel her presence there, could still hear her voice in his memory. "You're gone," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But you're not forgotten. I'll always remember you." He turned to leave Grayford and never come back. But before he could, the phone rang. The old payphone in the corner. Ethan picked it up and heard Maya's voice. "Ethan, I'm still here." She was a ghost, a shadow of her former self. But she was still there, connected to the city, part of it forever. "Goodbye, Maya," Ethan said. "I'll always remember you." "Goodbye, Ethan." He set the receiver down and walked out of the apartment. Grayford was quiet, its streets empty, its buildings dark. But somewhere, under the city, the dead were still singing. The lights of Grayford flickered and died at precisely 11:17 p.m., plunging the entire city into darkness. Ethan had just returned to his hotel room when the power went out. He stood in the pitch-black hallway, his heart pounding. He knew what was happening. The Bellman was making a move. He made his way through the city's dark streets. The phones were ringing again, a discordant chorus that echoed through the silence. He could hear the voices of the dead calling out, trying to find a way back to the living. And then, from the direction of the Bellwether Exchange, he saw a faint red glow. The Bellman was returning. Ethan moved toward the exchange, his steps quick and urgent. He reached the building, made his way into the lobby. The red glow was coming from the basement. He descended the stairs and found the first switchboard, its connections lit with a sickly red light. The Bellman was standing in front of it, his face hidden in shadow. "You cannot stop this, Ethan," the Bellman said. "The dead are rising, and they will have their revenge." Ethan shook his head, his determination unbroken. "I won't let you hurt anyone else." The Bellman laughed, a cold sound that echoed through the chamber. "You cannot stop me. I am the city." But Ethan had a secret weapon. He pulled a photograph of Maya from his pocket, a picture that showed her alive and happy, a symbol of everything he'd been fighting for. "If you're the city," Ethan said, "then I'm the memory. And memory is more powerful than forgetting." He raised the photograph, and the red light began to fade. The Bellman howled in rage, his power broken, his hold on the city shattered. The power returned, the lights flickering back to life. Grayford was saved. The Bellman stood at the edge of the platform, his figure dark and menacing. But there was something else in his expression now, something that looked almost like exhaustion. "You've won," the Bellman said, his voice a whisper. "The city remembers. The dead are free." Ethan nodded slowly. "Now you need to set Maya free." The Bellman hesitated, and then he nodded. "I can do that, but it comes with a price." "What price?" "You become the Bellman." Ethan stared at him, his mind reeling. "What?" "Someone must carry the weight of the dead," the Bellman said. "Someone must be the voice of the forgotten. If I let Maya go, I become mortal, and someone else must take my place." Ethan thought about it. He thought about Maya, about the life he'd had, about the life he could have. He'd already lost so much. What was one more sacrifice? "I'll do it," he said. "No." The voice was Maya's. She was standing in the shadows, her face pale but determined. "If anyone becomes the Bellman," she said, "then let it be me. I'm the one who came here looking for this. I'm the one who wanted to save the dead." "Maya, I know what I'm doing, Ethan," she said. "I'll be okay. You need to go." Ethan hesitated, and then he nodded. "I'll never forget you." Maya smiled, a sad smile that was full of love. "I'll never forget you either." She turned to the Bellman, and he reached out, touching her forehead. "Maya Ward," the Bellman said, "you are the new voice of the forgotten." And Maya disappeared. Grayford's survivors gathered in the St. Bartholomew's Church, a drafty stone building that had been a part of the city for over a century. They'd come to honor the dead, the forgotten, the ones who had been erased from memory and finally found again. Ethan and Laura were there, helping to organize the reading of the names. The list was long, nearly 300 names, the dead who had been buried in the tunnel collapse and then forgotten. Ethan read the first name, his voice strong and clear. "Arthur Hayes." Laura stepped forward, her face pale but composed. "Arthur Hayes was my grandfather. He was one of the people who signed off on the cover-up, but he spent the rest of his life trying to make it right." She paused, taking a breath. "He was a good man who did a terrible thing. I hope the dead can forgive him." She read the next name, and the next, and the next. The crowd listened in silence, their faces solemn. As each name was read, there was a sense of release, of the dead finally being acknowledged, finally being remembered. And then, at the very end of the list, there was a name that hadn't been there before. Ethan Ward. He stared at it, his heart pounding. He hadn't died, hadn't been erased. But somehow, he was still part of the forgotten, part of the city beneath the city. He looked up. Laura was staring at him, her expression one of concern. "Are you okay?" Ethan nodded slowly, a strange feeling settling over him. He was part of Grayford now, part of the city's history, its memory. He would always be here, always be connected to this place. He looked back at the list, at his name, and smiled. He was ready for whatever came next. The payphone was old, a relic from a time when the city had still been alive. It stood on a street corner, its glass cracked, its metal faded by decades of rain and sun. It was 3:17 a.m. when the last call came. Ethan had been walking through the city, trying to clear his head. The streets were quiet, the buildings dark. But in the distance, he could hear something, a faint ringing, coming from somewhere in the darkness. He followed the sound to the old payphone. Its receiver was off the hook, swinging gently in the wind. He hesitated, and then he answered it. "Ethan." It was Maya's voice, faint and distant. "I'm here," he said. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." "Thank you for saving me," he said. "For showing me what was really going on." "I had to," she said. Grayford needed someone to tell the truth. Ethan smiled. "You did good, Maya." "So did you." There was a moment of silence, and then the line went dead. Ethan set the receiver down, looked out at the empty street, the sleeping city. He knew he'd be back, that Grayford was part of him now, part of who he'd become. He walked away, the city's lights flickering gently in the darkness. And behind him, the payphone began to ring again.